They buried her just before noon. By dusk, the crowd was gone. The flowers had wilted and the last car had left. But Frank Monroe stayed. He wasn't ready to say goodbye. Not yet. He had survived war zones, surgeries, and 72 winters, but nothing had prepared him for this silence. So when the police lights cut through the cemetery fog and a voice shouted, "You're trespassing," Frank didn't move. Because to him, this wasn't trespassing. This was sacred ground. Frank Monroe hadn't planned to stay that long. The funeral had ended hours ago, and the last family member had offered him a quiet nod before leaving. But Frank didn't move. He stood beside Evelyn's grave as if waiting for her to speak. The late sun painted the headstones in soft amber, and the cemetery emptied, one careful goodbye at a time. Frank whispered things no one else would ever hear, things only a husband of 45 years could say. He rested one hand on the polished edge of the stone, the other still gripping the small velvet pouch he refused to open. The old suit he wore was too tight around the neck and loose around the waist. It hadn't fit right in years, but it was the same one he wore when he proposed. Pinned to his lapel was a faded service medal, half covered by the collar. His spine, once straight as a rifle, was slightly hunched, but his stance remained proud. Wind stirred the dry leaves around his shoes, but Frank didn't flinch. He had faced worse than wind. He had once held a friend's hand as he bled out in a crater, and somehow this felt even harder than that. The groundskeeper passed by once, slowing his cart, but saying nothing. He'd seen Frank earlier and nodded. Some things didn't need words. The gates clanged closed around 6, and the lanterns flickered on near the chapel. Still, Frank stayed. One last goodbye, he thought. Just one more moment. The pouch in his hand held something Evelyn had never seen, a letter he wrote during the Gulf War. He'd promised to show her someday, but never found the right time. Now, maybe too late, he would read it aloud to the only person who still mattered. He unfolded the paper with shaking hands, the ink faded but legible. His voice cracked as he read the first line, barely louder than the wind. "If you're reading this, it means I made it home." The rest dissolved into the breeze, but then headlights, bright, unforgiving. A cruiser pulled slowly onto the path, tires crunching over gravel. Frank squinted, shielding his eyes, but didn't step away from the grave. A young officer emerged, tall, squared shoulders, maybe late 20s. He walked with urgency, hand already near his belt. Frank stood still, unsure whether to speak or salute. The officer called out, "Sir, the cemetery's closed. You're trespassing." Frank blinked, then gently folded the letter. "I was just leaving," he said softly, though his voice carried the weight of everything he hadn't finished saying. The officer paused, perhaps hearing the grief in his tone, but procedure kicked in. "I need you to step away from the grave and come with me," the officer repeated. Frank looked at Evelyn's name carved in stone, the letters blurred. "Can I have one more minute?" he asked. The officer shook his head. "This is city property. You've already stayed past hours." Frank let out a slow breath and stepped back, not away from her, but closer to something else entirely. The memory of uniformed commands still echoed in him. Old instincts returned. He reached into his coat and handed the officer his ID. Name, date of birth, service number. "Please," he said again, voice steady now. "She was my wife for 45 years. I just needed to finish saying goodbye." The officer looked at the ID, then at Frank. There was a moment, maybe 2 seconds, when something could have shifted, but it didn't. The officer muttered into his radio, "Possible vagrant still on site. Refuses to leave." Frank heard every word. A dull ache rose in his chest. Not anger, not fear, disbelief. He lowered himself slowly to the bench by the headstone, the letter still in his lap. The officer stepped forward, now visibly agitated. "Sir, stand up now. You're resisting a lawful order." Frank didn't move. His knees ached and his body was heavy. "I'm not resisting," he said calmly. "I'm remembering." The young man didn't care. He reached for Frank's wrist. "You'll need to come with me." The metal cuffs caught the fading light. Frank's breath stopped. He looked again at Evelyn's grave, her name, her date, the fresh flowers already wilting. As the officer clasped one cuff around Frank's wrist, something inside him gave, not like a break, more like a silence deepening. He didn't speak, didn't resist, just allowed it to happen. The other cuff clicked shut. His mind drifted to desert nights, the smell of burning oil, the sound of boots crunching sand. But this felt colder, meaner, less human. The officer pulled gently, trying to guide him to the car. Frank stumbled, the weight of years pressing on his joints. The stumble was misread. The officer tightened his grip. "Stay still, sir. Don't make this harder." Frank couldn't believe it was happening. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't even angry. He was just tired. Tired in a way no one watching could ever understand. Then something changed. A sound from the gate. Shoes, several, hitting the pavement in rhythm. Slow, intentional. The officer turned, confused. Frank didn't look. Not yet. But he heard it, and something in him knew. This wasn't over. This wasn't how it would end. Frank didn't need to turn around. He had marched enough formations in his life to recognize that rhythm. Polished soles against pavement. A silence between each step that said more than words ever could. The officer loosened his grip slightly, just enough to look over his shoulder. And there they were, 6 figures in dress blues, each one with medals shining faintly under the dusk light. They weren't walking fast. They didn't need to. Their presence alone made the world quieter. Tommy Rodriguez led them. 28 years old, active duty Marine, and someone Frank had mentored at the VFW Hall. He knew the old man well, knew about Evelyn, knew what today was. When the call came from a neighbor saying something's wrong at the cemetery, Tommy didn't hesitate. He didn't ask who. He just put on his uniform, and when he arrived, what he saw made his hands curl into fists behind his back. Frank, in cuffs, confused, small, a police cruiser idling beside him like awaiting punishment. And a young cop, barely out of academy, trying to look in control. The Marines didn't raise their voices, didn't demand anything. They just walked, straight, steady, together. The officer froze, unsure of what this meant. Frank slowly turned his head and saw them coming. For the first time all day, his eyes began to well. He wasn't alone. Tommy didn't say a word at first. He looked at Frank, not at the cuffs, not at the patrol car, just into the man's face. And Frank nodded, barely. That was all Tommy needed. He stepped forward slowly and addressed the officer with a calm that felt heavier than any shout. "What exactly is the charge here?" The officer blinked, unsure how to answer. "Trespassing," he said, voice suddenly uncertain. "Refusing to leave after hours." Tommy nodded, slow, measured. "This man buried his wife today. Did he attack anyone? Damage anything? Threaten anyone?" The officer hesitated. "No, sir." "But then why is he in handcuffs?" Behind Tommy, the other Marines stood at attention, silent. A silent jury of men who'd been trained to recognize leadership and to challenge injustice when they saw it. A small crowd had begun to form at the gates. Neighbors, veterans, curious strangers. One woman pressed a phone to her ear. Another was already filming. The tension shifted, subtle but undeniable. The authority in the scene no longer belonged to the badge, but to the posture of 6 men in uniform. The officer stepped back. He refused to leave. He sat down. Tommy nodded again, because he couldn't stand anymore. He's 72, lost his wife today, and you tasered him. The question didn't need an answer. Frank's wrist bore the marks, red, tight, cruel. His breath was shaky, his hands trembling. But he was upright, just barely. Tommy stepped closer and unlocked the cuffs. The officer tried to object, but one look from the Marine shut him down. "You've done enough," Tommy said, voice low but firm. "We'll take it from here." Frank swayed, and 2 Marines stepped in, gently holding his arms, not restraining him, but supporting him, protecting. The cemetery director arrived out of breath, waving a clipboard. "Mr. Monroe has written permission." he announced to no one in particular. He was allowed to stay past closing today. It's in the funeral file. Everyone went quiet. The officer's face drained of color. Tommy didn't gloat, didn't shout. He just looked at Frank again. "Sir, would you like to continue your goodbye?" Frank nodded, this time with more strength. And the Marines guided him back to Evelyn's grave. One stood watch. One placed the pouch gently in his hand, and Tommy remained by his side, silent, steady, present. The letter was still there, slightly crumpled but intact. Frank opened it and read again, this time not to the wind, but to her. His voice cracked. The Marines didn't move. They stood guard, as if this moment were a battlefield, and grief was the enemy to hold back. Behind them, the crowd grew. Veterans from every branch, people holding flags. One man brought flowers. No one shouted. No one interrupted. They came not for spectacle, but to witness, to honor. The officer who had made the call now stood off to the side, unable to meet anyone's eyes. His radio crackled, but he ignored it. His hands were still shaking. His supervisor had just pulled into the lot. There would be questions, reports, maybe consequences. But none of that mattered now, not to Frank, not to Evelyn, not to the men standing beside him. They weren't there for politics. They were there because a brother had fallen to his knees, not in war but in love. And someone had decided that was a crime. But not today, not while they were watching. Frank folded the letter slowly, kissed it, and tucked it into the flowers on Evelyn's grave. "I made it home," he whispered. Tommy didn't speak, but his hand rested gently on the old man's shoulder. They stayed there until the wind softened and the sky turned a shade darker. The Marines never moved. The badge didn't matter, the law didn't matter, only the promise that no one who served would ever be left behind, not in battle, not in grief, not while brothers still stood. It wasn't about military protocol anymore. It was about something older, something sacred. Frank had come to say goodbye, and now finally he could, surrounded by silence, surrounded by honor. The news would travel far by morning. Clips, headlines, outrage, apologies. But the real story wouldn't be about a taser or a badge. It would be about a quiet march through cemetery gates, about the sound of medals clinking gently as justice arrived in dress blues, and the way 7 Marines reminded a nation what dignity still looks like. 3 weeks later, Frank returned to the cemetery, this time with a thick envelope pressed against his chest. The air was colder now, the leaves thinner, the sky a little grayer. He wore the same navy blue suit, freshly pressed, though the cuffs still bore faint creases from that day. The bench beside Evelyn's grave had been cleaned. Someone had left new flowers. Frank didn't know who. Maybe a neighbor. Maybe one of the Marines. He sat down slowly, joints cracking quietly beneath him, and placed the envelope in his lap. Inside were 7 handwritten letters, one for each Marine who had stood with him. He had written every word carefully, just as Evelyn had taught him. No rushed lines, no mistakes, only respect. Each letter began the same way. "I didn't know if I'd ever have brothers again until you walked through those gates." And from there, each one told the story only Frank could tell. He told them what it meant to be lifted up when the world tried to push him down, what it meant to see honor, not in medals, but in footsteps. He didn't write like a soldier. He wrote like a husband, a friend, a man who had been seen. As he finished folding the last letter, tears filled his eyes, not from grief this time, but from gratitude. He looked at Evelyn's name, softly touched the stone and whispered, "You were right. There's still good men left." The story had exploded. Within 48 hours, footage from the cemetery was everywhere. Cell phone videos showed the arrest, the taser, the moment the Marines entered the gates. News anchors argued over policy, talk shows debated police training. But none of that mattered to Frank. He didn't care about hashtags or headlines. He cared that people had remembered what respect looked like. The officer who tased him faced an immediate internal review. His body cam footage was placed under scrutiny. Witnesses gave statements. Veterans sent emails. Some demanded justice, others offered forgiveness. The police department issued a public apology and quietly placed the officer on administrative leave. But Frank never asked for punishment, only understanding. New protocols were introduced within weeks. Officers were now required to call a supervisor before arresting anyone over 65 for a non-violent infraction. Training was revised. Crisis counselors were added to shift rotations. But for Frank, the real reform had already happened. When 7 young men proved that service doesn't expire with age or rank, letters poured into Frank's mailbox, from veterans, from strangers, from widows and children and fellow Marines. Some were short. "You reminded me of my dad." Others told stories of lost spouses, of folded flags, of silent grief no one had noticed until now. He read everyone, kept them all in a box beside Evelyn's nightstand. And every morning he read one aloud to her grave. The Marines visited again unannounced 2 weeks later. No cameras, no news, just brothers returning to see a man they now called family. They brought coffee, a folded flag, and silence. Tommy placed a hand on Frank's shoulder, no words needed. Frank smiled, smaller this time, but stronger. They stayed for an hour, then saluted him before heading back through the gates, leaving nothing behind but footsteps and peace. Frank resumed his routine, visiting Evelyn twice a week, always dressed sharp. He brought flowers some days. On others, he brought stories. And when people passed by, they recognized him, not from the news, but from how gently he knelt by that stone. Children would wave, veterans would nod. He had become something more than a man who was wronged. He had become a symbol of what's right. The community had changed. The cemetery grounds were no longer just quiet. They were watched, maintained, respected. Young officers who patrolled there now greeted visitors with more than protocol, with presence. Some had even heard of Frank Monroe before ever meeting him, and when they finally did, they called him Sir. Frank never asked to be a symbol. He just wanted to keep a promise, the one he made at war, the one he made at his wedding, the one he made at the side of Evelyn's hospital bed, when her hands grew cold and her voice began to fade. "Don't let me be alone." And he didn't. Not that day, not ever. He kept showing up because love, like service, isn't just declared, it's lived. Through pain, through silence, through misunderstanding, through storms. And when others forget, it's the quiet ones who remember. The ones who still stand when no one is watching. The ones who stay after the gates are locked. Frank didn't need a parade. He didn't want revenge. He just wanted to finish his goodbye. The kind of goodbye that can't be rushed or scripted. The kind that takes everything you have and gives something back, something lasting, something real. Evelyn's grave became a landmark, not because of her name, but because of what happened beside it, because of who knelt there, because of who stood, and because the world saw what honor looks like when it's wrapped in a blue suit and a trembling hand. Months passed. The story faded from the news, as they always do. But in homes across the country, people remembered. And in one small town, an old man with a cane and a medal kept walking the same path, week after week, with a heart still full of words, and a pouch still tucked inside his coat. Frank knew he wouldn't have many more years to make the trip. His body was slower, his steps shorter, but each one still mattered because every step said, "I'm still here, and she still matters." That to him was everything. That was the oath no uniform could revoke. One morning he left a final letter, addressed not to the Marines, not to the police, but to whoever might kneel there next. It read simply, "If you ever feel forgotten, stand anyway. You're never truly alone." He sealed it, placed it under a stone, and walked away. No trumpets played, no headlines ran. But as he reached the gates, a soft breeze swept through the trees, and somewhere he thought he heard her voice again, laughing, whispering, proud. And for the first time in a long time, Frank Monroe smiled without crying. Service ends, Honor does not.